on some different things that we were looking at, including health insurance. That was one of the objects that we wanted to talk about today. And then we'll have our final draft of our budget today for the board to make their decisions with. We'll look at some different tax levy options and how that will affect our budget. Our wish list items that we talked about a month ago, we'll have some cost projections on those and see where we can fit any of those in if possible. Summarize everything and then open it to you guys, all right? All right. Fund balance. Probably one of the most complicated areas of school finance that I've encountered, and it is oftentimes difficult to wrap your head around because it's so much different than what we do for our personal finances. So in our fund balance projection, there's two main types of fund balance: appropriated fund balance and unappropriated fund balance. So those are the two we're going to focus on tonight. Unappropriated fund balance are the funds that we have that we can allocate where we need them. Appropriated fund balances are our reserves on monies that we have tied up, whether it's on a purchase order that we haven't paid yet, things that we're going to take forward into next year. So while they count towards our fund balance, they're not readily usable for us. So first we'll look at our unappropriated fund balance. This is the 4% fund balance that people talk about. How do we calculate it? Now this is a projection based on our end of February data. I will be updating this for you every month and it will change, but this is our best estimate based on prior year expense patterns and where we are so far this year. So year-end 6/13 fund balance. This is the 2.9 is our fund balance that we had at the end of last fiscal year, and that's reflected in our audited statements. Our reserves were part of that. That 2.9 includes our appropriated and our unappropriated. So if we take out our reserves of 1.3 million, it leaves us with our unappropriated fund balance. And this is what we were left with at the end of June for unappropriated funds. From that, we take this year's projected revenues and we subtract out our expenditures, and we're left with this year's proposed or assumed unappropriated fund balance. So we're looking at about 1.1 million to have left this year. Now this is a very conservative number. This is if we take all of our lines and spend them down to zero, with the exception of the lines that we know for one reason or another that we're not going to need. But like our supply lines, our contractual lines, things that we may not know about, we're assuming all of those are going down to zero. So any monies that we don't spend in those will be added to our fund balance as we go on. We have already been talking in our budget about appropriating 1.1 million, which is the same number we've been using this year, and I believe we used it last year too, which would leave us at the end of this year with an unappropriated fund balance of 42,000, which is low, very, very low, very low. It's 0.24%. So 4 is the goal. It's the maximum allowed by the state, and 3% is the minimum recommendation. And that minimum recommendation comes from our fiscal accountability reporting. We all know we were on the moderate fiscal stress reporting. One of those numbers is generated by how much fund balance you have. If you're under 3%, you earn numbers. You earn points on that. The fewer points you have, the lower you are. So we had 45 points, which put us 1 point into moderate. If we had 44 points, we would have been in the susceptible range with most of the other districts in our area. But this is one of those factors. We had about 2.4% fund balance going into this year, unappropriated fund balance, but because it was under 3, that earned us points. This would be even worse. If this is where we ended up, 0.24 would be even worse. What this would mean, if you think about big picture, this year we know we had $1 million come off our expenditures due to the debt service. We know we plugged the hole with 1.1 million this year. So really we had $2 million change. Next year, if we spend all of this 1.1 million this upcoming year, at the end we'd only have 42,000 left. take that into account when we won't have $1 million coming off our fund balance next year, or off our capital expenses. That won't happen again next year. And this year, our expenses went up about $1 million, which is why our budget to budget from last year to this year is relatively flat, because our $1 million in expenditures was offset by the $1 million we saved on our debt service. But when we don't have that next year, and we don't have another $1.1 million to plug in, we'll have a budget gap of about $2 million. So it is just crucial that we start to rebuild this fund balance. In this little call box over here, I just spelled out what some of our reserves were and the amounts that comprised that $1.4 million. And these are right off our financial statements from the auditor from June 30th. These are funds that are available for us to use, but for very specific purposes, which is why the restricted fund balance are appropriated and they're not in our unappropriated amounts. So this is our unappropriated, the money that we can spend. In addition to wanting at least 3%, if not 4%, of the appropriated, the state will also look at our overall fund balance, and that includes our reserves. So here we had again the 2.9. We don't take out our reserves because now we want to include them and get an overall total. Our projected revenues, our expenditures, and then our change in reserves. That's just an estimation of possible interest that we'll earn in those reserve accounts. Again, taking out the 1.1 that we're plugging into next year's budget, and it leaves us with 1.439. So that, on a projected budget, is 8.11%. If you don't have at least 10%, you earn points on that fiscal stress. So 8% isn't awful, but it's not great, and it isn't great when we have 0.23% of our unappropriated fund balance. Anyone have any, you guys have any questions on that? I know it's very complicated. It really is just taking what you ended with last year, adding in the monies you received, subtracting out whatever you spent, and we had a deficit that we were plugging the hole with, and then seeing where you end up. We want to be at 4% unappropriated and a minimum 10% total, and we're not quite there. So our budget. These are, again, slides you're accustomed to seeing by now. They're very similar in layout. They're the same as last time. We deleted draft 1 column because we looked at that twice. Here's what we talked about last time. We have revised this a little bit. We met with Jen Lilly from Erie 1 BOCES and John O'Connor from Erie 2 BOCES to go over line by line things we're spending, making sure we are maximizing our revenues. Most of the dollar amounts stayed the same. Some of the bigger changes were funds that we had reduced this year or we weren't utilizing those services. So we've pulled some of these funds out and we've put them into our computer-assisted instruction line. And this would be allocated towards an IPA, which would allow us to buy the one-on-one devices for our elementary and high school that we had talked about. It would be a 3-year plan with about $18,000 the first year and $15,000 the second 2. We do receive aid on those dollars, so it's a benefit to be able to put that in. And because it didn't drastically change our overall line, we just kind of moved some of the money around and then was able to find a way to possibly buy the devices that would be used with the new wireless system in the elementary and high school. Our expenditures. We do have some good news on our expenditures. Again, same format as what we've been looking at. The big change here is our health insurance. Up to this date, we've been going with a 20% increase. I spoke with Pete Lovering last night, and he said that we can expect 13.5. Still quite high, but better than what we were looking at. So that gives us an overall expenditure increase of decrease of $234. So even with all our increases in salaries and health insurance and employment or retirement contributions, we're still reducing our expenditures from this current year by almost $250,000. revenues. Revenues have been pretty flat the last couple times we've been talking because there's not a whole lot we can do about it. One thing that we have changed this time, we've added $50,000 to our state aid. This is more than what's on the governor's proposed runs that we received about 2 months ago. But because we're doing the wireless project with BOCES, the $130,000 project in this current year, we will realize that aid next year. So in speaking with John O'Connor today, I asked him if he felt the $50,000 was a safe number to put in there because we don't want to overestimate our revenue and then end up short. He thought that that was a conservative number and that we would be safe with that. So we were able to increase that aid a little bit. We're still showing a significant deficit on our revenue side, but that was due to the loss in aid that we knew we were receiving all along. And then overall, our expenditures are decreasing to $135,000. Revenues are decreasing by $407,000, which leaves us a budgetary shortfall of $172,000. Even though we're reducing our expenses because our revenues were decreasing more than that, we still end up with the negative balance. Okay, so the options. We looked at this slide last time. I made a couple edits to it this time. Now that we have some more firm numbers, I wanted to show you how our tax levy changes would affect our bottom line.